Hello, I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute at Washington State University. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today, which features Kiantha Duncan, who is the current president of the NAACP in Spokane, and she'll be speaking about poverty and inequality in communities of color. This is part of the Foley Institute's semester-long series on the politics of inequality, which examines the causes, consequences, and perceptions of rising inequality in the US and around the world. Many of you know that economic disparities have reached levels not seen in more than a century. Last year, the 50 wealthiest Americans had more wealth than the bottom 50%, 165 million Americans combined. Moreover, the pandemic, the Time's Up movement, Black Lives Matter protests, and other recent events all highlight nagging problems with racial, gender, social class, geographic, and other forms of inequality. There's no doubt that the growing severity, both in the realities and the perceptions of inequality, are giving rise to populist politics and social polarization in the US and elsewhere. Our series on the politics of inequality began with a distinguished lecture by the Nobel Prize economist Angus Deaton from Princeton University. And it includes nearly a dozen other lectures by distinguished scholars and commentators on various aspects of inequality, including today's discussion about inequality in communities of color. If you'd like more information about this series or any of our events, please visit us at foley.wsu.edu. And if you miss these events, you can see them later on the Foley Institute's YouTube channel. Let me also thank the College of Arts and Sciences at WSU for their support of the Foley Institute and their support of this series. Now it is my pleasure to introduce to you today's guest, Kiantha Duncan, who is the current president of the NAACP in Spokane. Kiantha is an accomplished community organizer with experience bringing people together to engage in challenging conversations and developing solutions for the problems facing our region and our society. Among her many roles, Ms. Duncan also currently serves on the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the Terrain Arts Organization, the Karl Maxey Advisory Board, and the Spokane Public Schools Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee. Prior to moving to Spokane in 2016, Ms. Duncan managed programs serving the homeless and victims of domestic violence and leading the Black Pride Organization in Seattle, Washington. Ms. Duncan has indicated she plans to speak for about 30 or 40 minutes, and after that, we'll have some time for discussion. If you have questions, I encourage you to send those to me at tsfoley@wsu.edu. Again, that's tsfoley as in Tom S. Foley @wsu.edu. So Kiantha, I'm going to turn the time over to you now, and I'll be back later with some questions from our audience.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I am excited first and honored to be with you today to share some conversation around poverty and how poverty shows up in communities of color, specifically the Black community. Now, I have some good news and some bad news for you. The good news is I have no PowerPoint presentations. There will be no presentations. We're going to have a conversation, meaning I'm going to share with you, and hopefully you will interact as much as you can on through the chat feature, and we can answer your questions towards the end. The great news is that I am going to give you a different kind of presentation. So typically when we talk about poverty, when we talk about hardship, and we talk about Black community, we like to start out with giving statistics, right? And I know that as scholars, statistics are very important. However, I am going to ask and push you in this conversation to be prepared to hear actual narratives and stories. I thought about how I wanted to present this information to you all, and after contemplating and thinking about what my ancestors might say, what my grandmother might say, what my great-grandmother might say, I decided that I would share my story and I would share their stories with you. And through that, we would circle to get to poverty and the effects of poverty in Black community and how that showed up in real time. I'd first like to tell you a bit about the way in which the story will go. We'll deconstruct this a bit, because what I want you to see is many of the experiences that I have had as a child growing up in poverty, they were inevitable based on the experiences that my mother had, which were inevitable based on the experiences that her mother had, all around poverty. There was no piece of it that's not due to poverty. So I'll tell you a bit about myself and my story. I was born and raised in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Right now, Milwaukee is #1 in the nation as far as being the most segregated city in the nation, the #1. For many years, it was #2. And so as a child, growing up, everything around me was Black. My friends were Black, my neighbors were Black, the people who lived around the corner from me were Black. The mailman in my particular area, they were Black. Service delivery drivers were Black. The people that were not Black, however, were people that were in positions of power. So that would be positions of like law enforcement, teachers, case managers, and you'll understand why case managers matter in the link to poverty soon too as well. But all of those positions of power were people that were white. And as a child, of course, because this was the environment that I grew up in, I did not know that that was poverty. I did not know that those were inequalities that were showing up even in who lives where and who does what job, who has access to what wealth building opportunities. I did not understand that that was all related to poverty. As a child, I want to give you some examples of what poverty looked like in my own life and how that showed up. The first example is one that I can remember so vividly. I mean, it's like I can remember it today, like I can feel it today. There were opportunities, as in all schools take children on field trips. And I remember being a kid and being so excited that we were going to go on a field trip. And the field trip was to the museum in my city. I'll never forget this. And so we had been, of course, like, you know, the teacher leads up to this is what's going to happen. We were going for a social studies field trip and the lead up to the lessons and kind of tying them all in together so we would understand some of the materials that we would see at the museum. Well, on the day of the field trip, my family, because they were a family living in extreme poverty, did not have money to give me for a cold lunch. Now think about how simple that is. Money for a cold lunch. When kids go on field trips, they are asked to bring cold lunch because they won't be eating lunch in the cafeteria, so there won't be hot lunch available. But for children who, like me, were living in poverty, who depended on the hot lunch that was provided in the school, children like me who were food insecure, there was no cold lunch. And so what we ended up doing, it was me and a few other of my friends also, we got a lunch from the school cafeteria. Now, the school cafeteria's lunch was an orange or an apple, a milk which would be hot by the time we got to eat it at lunchtime at the field trip, and a sandwich. Now, as a child, I again did not understand that that was happening because it was a food insecurity in my family. I didn't understand that. And children are not expected to understand things like that. But we can look at the statistics, we can look at the numbers and see that there are millions of children in our education system in the United States who are food insecure. And so this is an example. The field trip was an example of what that food insecurity looked like for me and what it often looks like for those children who are also experiencing that in those families. I want to give you a couple other examples because people like examples. I like examples. There was a time that, and I don't know if they still do this because now I'm a grandmother, so I don't know. But when I was in elementary school, there used to be an annual book fair that came to all of the elementary schools. Now, the book fair was an opportunity for students to purchase books from the book fair. It was a big deal. There was a pamphlet, a little catalog of what books were going to be available. And every year, I remember as a child feeling very sad when those booklets, those catalogs were handed out, because I knew that there was a possibility and a probability that I would not be able to buy books because my family could not afford that. That was another real-time example of financial insecurity that happens as a result of poverty, and it shows up in so many different ways. I also remember as a child going with my mother to, back then it was at a local high school, and going and being a child in this long line. I'm talking about the line was around the corner, and not knowing what this line was for. I just knew we stood there for a very, very long time. Well, what I learned was that after waiting in that line for a very long period of time, as the line inched up and it became my mother's turn to be at the front of the line, what we were receiving were government issued staples, meaning we were receiving dry milk, we were receiving an allotment of butter, we were receiving pork in a can, chicken in a can, dry eggs. Those were the things that the government was providing for poor families. And that was the experience that many children, again, I'm telling my story, but in my story, I know that it's the story of so many other children as well. So our families, again, we are not knowing that that's what poverty means or that's what poverty looks like, but it was what was needed. It was necessary. So not only did our families, and this is the families of poor children, receive food stamps and food entitlements from the government, that was not enough. That was not enough. So those food stamp dollars did not stretch long enough to get an entire family through an entire month. And so there had to be some backup plans, and those backup plans always included going to either the food pantry, or going to the government handout at the schools that they were at. Now, again, I didn't know that this was irregular because, as I mentioned, I live in a segregated city. So that meant everybody around me was pretty much doing the same thing. So it wasn't just my family. Poverty has a way of excluding people of color, excluding us from everyday needs. And poverty also has a way of including us all together in some teams that we'd rather not be on the team. Meaning I'd rather not be on the team of the child that's getting food from the food bank or who is having to get the cold lunch from the cafeteria. There was a lack of support, financial support for my family. Of course, my mother was not able to get a paying job and a good job at the time because my mother was a teen mother. So as a teen mother, your opportunities for employment are very limited. They're very limited. My mother at one point had to drop out of school, and that was to provide for me and provide for herself. That is another way that in poor communities, poverty affects us. There is no area that's not affected, I'll say that. When you look at your ability to gain employment, when you look at your ability to build generational wealth through acquiring real estate or purchasing a home or having stocks and things like that, all of that is stripped from poor communities. And so when people often think, well, why didn't they just do this thing or that thing? I don't know that they always realize that this or that thing may not have been accessible when you are living in extreme poverty. So back to my mother. So my mother, like I said, was a teen mother. So she had minimal education in the beginning. She later went on and returned to school and got her doctorate. But she was a person, a child living in poverty herself, having multiple ACEs. We are now getting to the point in our world where we are talking about the impact of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, on people of color and on the poor, and how that impacts how we move and what we're able to do. And so my mother was a person who had over 5 ACEs, meaning she had a hard life. And part of that hard life was due, in fact, to poverty. It was less about making poor choices. It was less about not pulling herself up by her bootstraps, that thing that we say. But it was more about poverty and living in poverty. She just didn't have have access to certain things. Now I want to talk about the reality, my mother's reality. My mother was also raised by a person, my grandmother, who had also lived in poverty, My grandmother was born in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and she migrated north, like many, many Black families did, migrated north from the South, wanting to seek better opportunities for their children and their families, wanting to seek opportunities for education and work. And so she migrated to Chicago, Illinois. Now, let's talk about poverty once you make the migration. So poverty post-migration. It was not the same as the South. It was not the same as the Jim Crow South. While there were still civil rights fights that were happening in the South and around the United States, really, what was different was that the North presented an opportunity to access more. So an opportunity to access education, an opportunity to access gainful employment. But what happened to many families, and what interrupted that opportunity, was that you are moving people who, again, started out with minimal or no education due to poverty. Poverty is what removes the opportunity of education from children of color. So you're taking those kids and young adults and you're moving them north, which is great because it's giving them a seemingly opportunity, but you're moving them, and everything that they had in the suitcase in the South is in the suitcase in the North. So there is still low education. There is still high ACEs in those people who migrated north. My grandmother did not have access to education as a child. So I want to tell you an example of that. So kind of like the field trip example. So my grandmother, and I've also heard other older Black women talk to me about this experience where you had 2 sets of clothing. You had one dress that you wore on Sunday. That was your church dress, because the church has always been instrumental in the lives of people of color, especially poor people. And so you had that one dress, and then you had whatever clothing you were able to wear when you were out either working in the field or doing something aside from your needing to be dressed up for church, because that was a respectable time. So there was one set of clothes that she wore regularly. Now, what does that have to do with poverty? Well, of course, it has everything to do with poverty. Poverty shows up in many different ways, so many different ways. And when you look at lack of access to the minimal, meaning clothing. So we've talked about not having access to food, but now this is even clothing, simple things that we take for granted every day, shows up differently for us. My grandmother talked about when she began school. And when she was in school, elementary school, the school was actually in a church. It was not in a school building. So when you look at the differences in how children perform in education, and you look at the experiences of Black children who are growing in communities of poverty versus white children who have access to education, everything is different. Everything is different. There is no way that if you are attending school in a church room and you have a teacher who is trained to teach, obviously, but in most cases from the community that they are teaching in, that's very different than going to a school where you have access to labs, you have access to multiple teachers, you have access to multiple styles of learning and books, lots of books. Poverty strips communities of color from all of those things that are really natural and should be given to everyone, to everyone. Children in communities of color like me, like my grandmother, like my mother, they did not have those very basic needs, which ultimately impacted the way they were able to show up, and it impacts the way in which I show up even today. So let's go back even more. My grandmother, whose name was Geraldine, her mother's name was Matilda. Matilda, who grew up in a time where the best that she could hope for was to get a job as a sharecropper, working on the fields, in the fields. My grandmother's hands, and this is just, I've seen it in stories, but this is true. My grandmother's hands seemed like they were about double the size of mine, my great-grandmother. And I remember my grandmother, Matilda, her hands were so hard. And I didn't understand what that was. I did not understand that her hands were hard because they were calloused, because she was working in a field. There were not other opportunities for her to work in other places because she was born into poverty. So there was not a chance that she was going to have a job at the local store or a market or an office or anything like that. The reality was poverty anchored her to certain fields and so certain opportunities, and that opportunity in most cases was sharecropping. So that was my grandmother Matilda's experience. My grandmother Matilda's mother, her name was Comfort. I've always said that's such a great name. If I could have any name other than Kiantha, it would be Comfort. But my grandmother Comfort also high ACEs, very high ACE score, born into poverty, lived in poverty her entire life, did not have food security, so she was very food insecure. She did not have appropriate health or mental health access. So there was the health and mental health disparity there. She did not have housing security. She did not have her basic needs met. And all of this, again, was because of poverty, the role of poverty. So if I can look back in my own life and realize that all of the things that I am connected to, so my ancestors, my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and my great-great-grandmother, all come from poverty in the Black community. If I can see that now, what it allows me to do is to do work like the work that we do in the NAACP, the work that ensures that everyone is given access to basic needs. Everyone is given access to a right to work and a right to make fair wages. And everyone has access to wealth building, including those who typically would not. I am very grateful to have learned and to be here and alive in a time where I can see the advancement and advancements that have happened for people of color. But I will tell you that the number of people of color, the number of Black people still living in extreme poverty is still very, very high. I was listening, or I was actually reading something the other day, and there was a quote from Mr. Buffett. And the quote said that someone is sitting under a tree today, sitting in shade, because someone else planted a tree a long time ago. I thought about that when I read it and thought, wait, well, that applies to everything. What we are experiencing today is based on something that happened, something that was planted, some situation created years and years ago. So if my great, great, great grandmother lived in poverty, did not have access to education, did not have access to healthcare, mental health care, if she didn't have all those things, then the next person in her lineage wouldn't have them as well. And the next person wouldn't have them as well. And the next person wouldn't have them as well. So when I have the opportunity to speak to you all here at the Foley Institute about poverty, and specifically poverty in the Black community, it was important for me to give you examples of what that actually looks like. Now, I am in no way of the mind that poverty for anyone is okay, whether it be a child of color, a Black child, a white child, a Native child, an Asian child. It doesn't matter. Poverty is something that we have got to figure out a way to create a world in which everyone has access to their basic needs. Because if we don't do that work at this stage, then we are planting the tree that will provide the shade years ahead, years from now. There is an opportunity for all of us, especially those who are scholars, for those who work in education, who work in policy. There is an opportunity for us to look at not just the overall issue of poverty, but also look at how it actually impacts people's lives every day. So my goal was to give you examples to see how that shows up, how that showed up all along the way. And I think that when we look at poverty specifically in communities of color, I think if we are to make any change, it's going to require us to do a number of things. So I have some ideas about what can be done, but I will say this, the one thing that is so important is to eliminate as much as possible, eliminate on the policy level, eliminate inequality on a policy level. Because when you eliminate inequality, then that means everyone has access to the same things. I can only imagine what my great-great-grandmother, Matilda, and my great-great-great-grandmother, Comfort, would have achieved had they had access to education. I can only imagine how long they would have lived if they had access to health care and mental health care. I can only imagine. So if that is my story, certainly that has to be the story of many, 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 many other people in our world, not just in the United States, but in our world. So Milwaukee, Wisconsin, let's go back to that for a second. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, still today, very segregated. It is a city that lives with lots of crime, lots of crime. There is resources available to some folks, but there are so many people who cannot access resources to get them out of the place that they are in. There is still a lack of educational opportunities for everyone. And so I made a decision to leave Wisconsin because I wanted to make sure that I had given myself as an adult and my young child, my son, an opportunity to experience life differently. I knew that in the Pacific Northwest, he would receive better education because I knew that he would likely attend schools that were primarily white. And that is where resources are typically distributed. Now I'm not making that up. And it just is, it is what it is. That's how things work. And so moving here to Washington State was again my attempt to move as far away as I could from poverty and to access other resources that would help to build a life that was sustainable and comfortable for me. My time in Eastern Washington has been very interesting. I've learned so much about poverty in the communities here in Eastern Washington. I've learned about the experiences of Native children. I've learned about the experiences of Black children and Latinx children in Eastern Washington and their families and the resources that their families have lacked. And it is because of that that I continue to do the work that I do, and try and be involved in as many different leadership opportunities as possible so that I can share their story, so I can share my story, so I can share my grandma Geraldine's story, my great grandmother Matilda's story, and my great great grandmother Comfort's story. We are not special people per se. We just happen to be Black people in America. And we happen to be people who have lived based on the residual of slavery, because slavery is also at the core of poverty. So I am grateful that I had some time to speak with you all today. I see we have some questions coming in. Our 30 minutes went by so fast. I would love to have a question and answer session and be able to address as many of your questions as possible. And again, thank you so much for inviting me here to share with you all today. Mr. Cornell, I'm going to ask you to come back on so you can help me with the questions, because it's difficult for me to read them and answer at the same time. So tell me what they are.
Sure. Thanks, Kiantha. That was very interesting. So yeah, we have several questions. Let me start with one from Gus Waters. He asks, what are a few things you would change about Washington's welfare and job creation policies in order to promote economic and political power in communities of color?
That's a good question. What I would say first, Gus, is that in order for us to just change the Washington's welfare system, that would not be enough, okay? And here's why. The welfare system has to be shifted, right? Because the current way that welfare is set up in the United States of America really does not work. It does not work. And so that has to be shifted, but that shift can only happen almost like spokes of a wheel that fit together, right? So the shift here can only happen if there's also going to be a shift in access to education, access to workforce. All of those systems have to be changed simultaneously, because if you just shift one, then, okay, let's say we make a shift to the welfare system, but then what do we do with the people that still, required or leaned on or have been a part of that system for so long? If we are not then giving them access to education, access to other opportunities, then we're actually going to make their life be at even more of a detriment. So my answer to how do we change the Washington welfare system is we really need to look at how these systems are all tied together, and versus trying to change one system at a time, we are going to have to change systems in tandem so that things can actually work for communities.
Yeah, maybe I'll just follow up on that, because right now Congress, of course, is debating the Build Back Better bill from the Biden administration. Are there specific policies in there you think are critical that get passed?
So I'm not familiar with all of the policies that are in that bill. So I would prefer not to answer that, just because I want to make a clear answer coming from an educated place. And because I don't know them all, I don't have an answer for that, but I will read into them. I'll find out.
Okay. So Taylor Carness asks a question about you personally. She says she'd be interested to know how you got involved in nonprofit advocacy work and what brought you to your current position at the NAACP in Spokane.
Oh, absolutely. So thank you, Taylor, for that question. How I got involved in advocacy work actually started over 25 years ago. I got involved in human service work, human and health services work. And like many, I'm so glad you asked this question, because like so many people, who work in nonprofit organizations, I started doing the work because I saw the need and I knew how valuable that service, that support would be in my life if I had had access to that resource. And so that is the story of many people who work in nonprofit. They are not there because of the money, because as you know, those are the least paid positions in most cases. Even when you are talking about executive level leadership, it's still so far beneath what the pay should be. But people are there because they feel, they understand, and they're empathetic to the need. Nonprofit organizations support people on the most basic levels, most basic levels. And so for me, that just felt like a natural place to be and to build a career in. And so I started, doing simple work like, well, it's not so simple, but things like case management, and sort of worked my way up into executive leadership in those organizations. And so based on that, I moved over to Eastern Washington, not sure what I would do when I got to Eastern Washington. I came over here because I got married and found myself working in philanthropy. And that was an opportunity to combine just everything that I've ever done all under one roof and one capsule. And so that is the interest in community and what was happening is kind of what led me to the NAACP.
Yeah, I wonder if you find special challenges here in Eastern Washington, given the fact that, well, especially here in the Spokane area, not so much in Central Washington, but in Spokane, we have less diversity than you find in, say, Seattle area or
Yes.
Milwaukee or other places. Are there special challenges for you here in this job?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I will say this, and I can laugh about it because if I don't maintain some level of softness in this work, it's not maintainable. You can't do this. I'm a person, again, based on my experiences, the experiences of my family. I come from poverty and ACEs, right? And so this work would trigger all your ACEs, everything. It triggers it all. And so I have to always keep a gentle heart in doing it so that I can be productive and helpful. Some of the challenges that I see here that are unique to Eastern Washington is we are still in a place where people are not even able to, they're not always able to even hear that there are racial disparities or hear that there is racism in Eastern Washington. Most other places, I think they've decided, yeah, it's here and we know about it. And so we're either going to do something about it or we're not. But in Eastern Washington, there's still so many people that cannot even wrap their mind around this being a reality. So that presents a different challenge. It presents daily an opportunity for me to step back with the information that I have to give and step forward with listening to hear other people's perspectives and other people's understandings. And then once I can hear and empathize with their standing and their reality, then I am able to introduce to them other realities that also exist. But no matter who you are, you want to feel important, you want to feel heard. And so this is a place that having the skill to do that is very important.
Okay. So Brianna Wadley asks, basically, what does it say about structural inequality when individuals such as yourself and many other people of color nevertheless achieve success in American society? And do you believe that white Americans are ever victims of structural inequality?
So white Americans can be victims of structural inequality, especially white Americans who live in poverty. That's the other thing about poverty. It's not just, relegated to Black communities. Poverty affects all communities. And so for any person, any race of person living in poverty or having experienced poverty, you will have challenges. That's just the bottom line. It is not just Black folks. So I'm glad you asked that question for clarity. And the question was, how do some of us get through that? Was that the question?
Yeah, I think she said, what does it say about this idea of structural inequality when there are individuals like yourself who've been successful in American society?
Yes, I think what it says is there are exceptions to every rule. There are exceptions to every rule. So yes, I have experienced this, and many other people like me. I have tons and tons and tons and tons of friends who have grown up with a history of poverty in their families and who have gone on to be very successful in their careers. Now, the number of people who have been able to achieve success is far, far less than the number of people who have not been able to achieve success. And so for me, that means that there's always a exception to the rule.
As long as we're talking about structural inequalities, I wonder what you make of this current controversy over critical race theory in schools. And actually, as someone, I teach political theory classes, and I cover critical race theory and other theories as part of that. And so I know it's not being taught in our public schools, but nevertheless, it's become a very potent issue in our elections. And so I wonder what what you think about that and how you see that controversy.
So interesting question. Not surprised that you asked it, but it is interesting because I have two feelings about this. The first is I wish that we could take away the title critical race theory. If we took away the title and kept everything that is taught in critical race theory, but no title, people would, I think, could be okay with it because it's truth. It is truth and reality of many people's experiences. And so what I think happens is that people hear there's this some kind of mechanism in our hearts or something that says if you say something about critical race theory, then that means that I cannot be patriotic and also love this country that I am a part of, that I am a member of, that I am proud of, that the two cannot exist together. But the reality is the two exist together. You have a country, we have a country to be very proud of, being an American citizen and being here and all of the great things that come along with that. That's a reality. And all of the history that came along with that is a reality. And so I think that it's necessary to teach truth. And it is not with the intent, at least from my understanding, it's not with the intent to make any person the bad person or the good person. It is just to say, this is the truth of what has happened in our society.
So Gus Waters asks, how do you explain poverty in communities of color to my white friends as an ally? I'm conflicted because I want to point out that many white people have a savior complex to people of color, while also pointing out that serious legislation is needed to address this issue.
Yeah, Gus, you call me. Call me. That's probably the way. You need some backup, Gus. You need backup because I think that what I believe people learn best from is true stories, true examples. So more than just statistics, more than just data, they need true examples to help them understand and wrap their mind around any particular concept. And so in trying to get white community to understand that may be something that you, as I'm assuming you're a white person, that you cannot get them to understand. They may need to have conversations with people like me, with other folks who can come and share to help them understand all of the nuances of poverty and racism.
Yeah, I'm really, I'm glad what you did is you talked about your own personal stories and life history. And I'm oftentimes flummoxed by how we address these issues, especially with young people, when we're educating young people, in a way that is true to the history of discrimination and poverty and other problems that our nation has confronted in the past, but at the same time balancing that with hope. And I oftentimes tell my students, for instance, that, they look at me, they think I'm 100 years old, but I'm not that old. But in my lifetime, when I was born, in a third of the United States, you couldn't marry somebody of a different race.
Right.
And in a third of the United States or more, well, really about half the United States, we had segregated public schools. And that was in my lifetime. And I hold that out as something that's hopeful, that we've changed dramatically. And young people today can't even realize how dramatic that change is. But at the same time, you need to tell the story, the fact that some of these inequalities persist and they continue on. So how do you balance that?
Well, I think it's important to, again, be honest. Be honest with your students, be honest with the young people that say, I just don't get it. I don't understand this stuff because that ain't during my time. That's back when y'all old people were, dealing with that stuff. That's not my reality. So you have to be honest in sharing the reality. You have to be open to understanding that they may not understand fully and that they will require a little extra attention and a little extra education in the way that speaks to them. So education in their language, the way they communicate, they need that in order to be able to wrap their minds around it. But the other thing is we can never lose sight of hope, ever, ever. If we lose sight of hope, back to the Warren Buffett quote, if we lose sight of hope here today, that also creates a tree that someone else is going to live under many years from now. And so hope is something that we have to hold on to, and we have to always be able to go back and grab more of it when we need it. So when we are feeling defeated, when we are seeing policies that are happening on a national level that feel like we are being defeated and that what we're working towards is not working, we have to have some way to go back and grab hope, grab that belief that something more can happen, something better can happen, and that there is better for us all.
Aaron Chattel asks, besides new policy, what are some other changes that would help address inequality and poverty?
Oh, Aaron, thank you, honey. This is simple. Move over. People have to move over. We have to distribute power differently than we do now. We have to distribute power differently. That shows up in every place. It shows up in educational institutes. It shows up in roles of leadership. It shows up in C-suite. It shows up everywhere. You have got to require that our current system expands and allows room for other diverse perspectives and thinking and ability, because everyone is unique. Everyone brings their own unique things. So if you're excluding me from a table, well, then you're missing the thing that I bring that is unique to me. And so to me, it feels like the answer is just really to move over. We've got to move over. We've got to move over. There's room for everyone. And I think that's back to the thing, that I mentioned about the critical race theory, or being someone who is patriotic. We can move over, and we can still make room for others, and we can still control things too. Like there's enough for everyone, and getting people to understand that is critical.
So we have a viewer on YouTube. You might have already addressed this question, but I'll give you another shot at it, who asks, can you talk a bit about specific issues that people of color face in terms of inequality here in Eastern Washington? Is it different to what you experience in Wisconsin or elsewhere?
It is different. It is different. And so again, I will tell you examples of my own life. Now, being a person who is relatively successful, however you measure success some days, but I in Eastern Washington have been called the N-word. I have been discriminated against in Eastern Washington in both employment and in just my natural community that has happened. Now, in Wisconsin, the difference is, in Wisconsin, where you're not allowed to be. So you already know, no matter what your education is, no matter what your level of information is, certain places, certain jobs, certain spaces you're not allowed to be in. It's point blank and period. Whereas here in Eastern Washington, there is this sort of veil that says you are allowed to be in those places, but the reality is sometimes we're really not. And I see that more here. Now, that is also a harder issue to address here, because it goes back to, again, most people here are not able to wrap their minds yet around the reality of disparities and the reality of poverty and the reality of racism. So to me, Eastern Washington is very different.
So, you mentioned a little bit about the role of church in communities of color and Black community in particular. And I wonder if you'd say a little bit more about that in terms of your experience with it growing up and how you see it changing or not changing over time. And I'm specifically thinking right now about the role that white evangelical churches are playing in, I think, sometimes fueling racist attitudes in our country today, and where the Black churches are with respect to these political developments.
Mhm. Good question again. Well, let me start off by saying the church, the church. So, meaning whatever your religious belief is, but in connection with Christianity. So, the church, the Christian church or the evangelical church, is one of the most racist entities anywhere. If you look at historically, that so the history of church and churching, the history of churching has always been segregated. It's always been segregated. So there were church services and church places of worship for Black people, and then there are places of worship for white people. The messaging was different in those churches as well. I think the messaging for Blacks in Black churches and spaces of worship has always been to, honor God, honor those who are in control, honor those who are in power, and those who are in power happen to be white. In every instance, they happen to be white. So that sends a subliminal message that keeps racism alive, even in the Black church. Now, in the evangelical church, I think that they too are attempting to follow the idea of following God and doing God's work. And I think that some of them do a really good job at that. But anytime that you're okay with doing a good job at that, when everyone around you looks just like you, that's a problem. There is a reason why everyone just looks like you. And so this happens even when white people in community want to go to Black churches. It's uncomfortable. You go into a Black church and 99% of the church is Black. The way that they worship, the charismaticness of the church, it's all very different to your faith history. That's uncomfortable to be in that space. But I can tell you, there is not a Black church that I know of, including the African Methodist churches, AMEs, that were specifically for Black folks. There is not one that there are not white members of. Because there is something about when you are in community of color, our ability to accept and embrace those who are different than us is just on a heightened level, maybe because we've always had to, I don't know why, but it's on a heightened level. And so I think evangelicals, it's not that they are bad people or attempting to do bad things. They just have not understood, one, the truth in history, the truth, and then they are not aware of ways to move forward. So the church is that's a tough conversation to have. You want to make somebody mad, say something about their church. Yeah.
So let me ask you about one other institution that's important, especially as it intersects race and poverty, and that is police. Where do you think we are with respect to police reform in this country, and more specifically in Washington and in Spokane?
Yeah.
Do we have a lot more to go, a little more to go, or are we about there? What do you think?
We have a lot more to go. We have a lot more to go. We have a lot more to go, but it's for interesting reasons that I say that. And again, this is my opinion. You've asked me my opinion. We have a ways to go because we are still in 2021. We are in a space as a community where we feel, we as in not me, we as in others, feel like they need to defend the actions of law enforcement. And that if you're not defending law enforcement, then you are against law enforcement. So there are these polarized views, which really is ridiculous. Everything is somewhere in the middle, right? And so if we look at the history of policing, let's talk about the reality of why policing was created. Yes, it was created to cut down on crime, but that crime was primarily to cut down on crime that people of color were doing to white communities, right? And so if that is the basis that this institution of law enforcement was built on, then we've got some work to do, and we got to get all the way down into the foundation in order to do that work. Eastern Washington, from what I see, and again, my opinion is that they're right about in the middle of the measuring tool, right? Down here is no, absolutely not. Nothing needs to change. We're perfect. Everything is great. And up here is we need to throw the baby and the bathwater out is here. So I think Eastern Washington is really somewhere around the middle, where those that are in leadership and law enforcement, many of them understand that there is work to be done, that there is historical issues that have to be addressed in order to make policing better. And reforming policing. And then there are those who feel like, they do better by causing friction in the community by saying there is no need for change in law enforcement. Getting everyone to a place where we can say with all certainty, we haven't done policing right. We did what we thought should be done. We made policy and structure around what we thought was best. And now we know more. Now we have more background information, more history. Now we know it needs to look differently. I think that's the goal, to get everyone to that point.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid our time is about up. Before I thank our guest, let me remind you that our next event in this series is Wednesday of next week on November 17th at noon. We have Joe Sauce from the University of Minnesota. He'll be talking about the criminal justice system and how oftentimes it preys on the poor in order to generate revenues for private companies and for local governments. So that should be a very interesting discussion. I encourage you to join us then. Now I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I want to thank Kiantha Duncan for a really interesting conversation. Thank you, Kiantha.
Thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone.
See you all next week.